This video is sponsored by VoxLink. More about them later on in the video. Transports are incredibly powerful in Warhammer 40k right now. There's a reason that rhinos and land raiders are not only very commonly seen in the competitive scene right now, but are almost required for the armies that have access to them. So today, let's dive into the mechanics of transports in Warhammer 40k, why they're so powerful, what they do, and ways to counter them. So let's dive in. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another rules deep dive video. In this video series, we break down every single mechanic surrounding one aspect of Warhammer 40k. Today, we're talking about transports. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content and my rules breakdown videos, please drop a like on the video, subscribe on the channel. It really helps out grow the community, and let's dive in. Obviously, transports are units that can put other units inside them and then transport them around the table, hence the name. Each transport's datasheet has a special section on it that describes what models can embark within the transport and any restrictions that they might have on their embarking. They'll also have a transport capacity, which is the number of models and size of units that can embark into a transport. But it should be noted that multiple units can be inside a transport at any one time. As long as you don't exceed that transport capacity in the number of models, you can have several units embarked within a single transport. Now, at the start of the game, a lot of this is declared during the battle formation step. This is the step in which you attach leaders to your units and put units into strategic reserve. After you decide your leader attachments, but before you put units into reserve, is the declare embarked transport step. And this is where units will start the game within a transport. Outside of dedicated transports, which we're going to talk about extremely shortly, you don't have to embark units in transports, and units can embark and disembark over the course of the game. Now, some transports during this step have the ability to combat squad the units embarked within them. This is kind of a colloquialism because of tactical marines that used to have the ability, and I think they still do now in the 10th edition codex, to split themselves into two smaller units. Those were called combat squads and allowed you to mix and match the heavy special weapons and melee weapons that you had in your units, or create little units with no special weapons just to be able to go sit on objectives. Some transports have the ability to use this baked in, such as Drukhari Venoms, Votann Sagitors, and Adeptus Sororitas Immolators. Now, the timing of this ability is super duper weird. You decide whether or not you're going to use a transport's combat squad mechanic at the start of the battle formation step. So that's before you do any of the other stuff that we just talked about. That unit turns into two smaller, equally sized units, usually 2 units of 5. These are then treated as 2 individual units from the original datasheet. Now, there is some weirdness about this currently, because those units are not necessarily at their starting strength. Your starting strength is calculated at the beginning of the game, and you'll add leader attachments onto it, but there's nothing that recalculates your starting strength. So you're creating 2 small units from a larger unit, meaning that both of those units are at half strength at the beginning of the game. Not sure that's intentional, and some events rule it that you recalculate their starting strength. For Adeptus Sororitas especially, it's a big deal, because if you lose models, then you will get the full benefits of your Hallowed Martyr detachment abilities. That's kind of funny. So what you'll do is, at the start of the battle formation step, elect a combat squad, split your unit into 2 halves. If you want to attach characters to either of those 2 halves, you can. However, one of the units must, at the end of that battle formation step, be embarked inside the transport that split them. So you can't attach characters to become a larger size than would fit within the transport. Effectively, you have to declare that you're using the combat squad ability well before the point at which you embark, and you're then locked into embarking when you get to that step. The sequence of events is kind of strange, but it's so that there is no weirdness with attaching characters to split units. And that moves us on to dedicated transports. Now, dedicated transports is a particular type of transport unit. Unlike regular transports, like we talked about at the beginning, you do actually have to embark units inside your dedicated transports. During that step of the battle formation step, if you don't have any units embarked within your dedicated transports, that dedicated transport is considered destroyed. Your guys have abandoned it and left it behind. Dedicated transports are typically the transports that are dedicated to transporting things rather than carrying weapons around and transporting units kind of as a side gig. These are things like rhinos, razorbacks, immolators, and sagitors, like the units that we talked about previously. There are some benefits to being a dedicated transport. It's not all bad, and it's not all just restrictions. Dedicated transports can be taken in up to 6 per list rather than the normal 3. They're kind of like the battle line equivalent of transport units. It should be noted, however, that the thing you have to embark into them isn't isn't necessarily a full squad, and you don't have to fill their transport capacity. So it's fairly common to embark individual characters or small utility units. As long as they satisfy the transport requirements, they can start in the dedicated transport and then immediately disembark on the first turn if you don't necessarily want to use the transport for its capacity to move things around. Last but certainly not least, dedicated transports also get a little bit of a buff if you embark scouts within them. If at the start of the game, every single model embarked within a dedicated transport has the scout's ability, the transport also gains that scout ability. And if you are including any characters or other units inside that transport that do not have scout, it will not benefit. Every single model has to have the ability. This video has been sponsored by Voxlink, a new social media app designed by gamers for gamers. Whether or not you're brand new to Warhammer 40,000, getting back into the game, or just moving to a new location, finding a community that meshes with your playstyle, plays the type of games that you want, and values the same things on the tabletop that you do is of paramount importance for everyone to enjoy the game. It offers a place to find and meet new members of the community and find players and events in your local area to meet up for games. Voxlink is available totally free for users on Android and iOS, and you can find links to download it in the video description and the card on the screen right now. Currently, it offers a live feed and social media features so you can post about your games, upcoming events, or even just models that you've painted. It also showcases content from a variety of different content creators in the tabletop gaming sphere, including yours truly. We embarked on a quest to become the #1 liked channel on Voxlink, and I'm happy to say that we succeeded. So big thanks to everybody who joined the app and hit that heart button next to Tactical Tortoise. If you haven't done that yet, please go do so, and just check out Voxlink for all the cool features that it has. So I'll see you there. So with that, we've talked a lot about embarking transports at the beginning of the game. Let's talk about exactly how that works during the game. While embarked within a transport, the unit is removed from the table and is essentially not in the game. They can't be affected by things. They're not targetable by things. You can't affect them with abilities or stratagems. They're basically in a little bit of like a shadow zone, the weird pocket dimension that allows a tiny Rhino APC to carry 12 Space Marines.
Get in.
We're going clapping.
However, they can then disembark the transport in order to participate in the game. So we're here in Tabletop Simulator to talk about exactly how disembarking transport works. We have a Land Raider Redeemer here and a unit of tactical marines that are going to be disembarking from the transport. When you do so, you take that unit from its position off the table and you place it wholly within 3 inches of the transport. That means that every part of the base of every model must be within that 3-inch aura. You essentially create a ring around the transport and everybody has to stand inside that. Now, there are some restrictions on what a unit can do after it disembarks. A unit can disembark before a transport moves, and when it does so, that unit is free to move, shoot, and charge as normal. In this way, disembarking a transport can actually increase the threat range of units slightly, because you're going to get that 3-inch buffer zone that the unit is able to move after disembarking from, and then extend their threat range beyond where the transport was to begin with. So transports, even if they're themselves not moving, still makes their embarked units a little faster, because you get that extra placement distance. However, if the unit was embarked and the transport moved, then the unit is much more restricted. They can still disembark at the end of the transport's movement. If they do so, however, that unit cannot move or charge. They can only shoot. Now, obviously, the Land Raider is maybe a little bit of a bad example here because Land Raiders specifically allow you to charge after they themselves have moved, but units disembarking from transports normally still cannot. So all they're going to be doing is shooting and taking table space. This still gives you a huge amount of additional threat range if you're using them to deliver your ranged attacks, since you'll usually get a 10 or 12-inch movement out of the transport, plus the 3-inch disembarkation, and you'll get a lot of maneuverability to see around corners and poke yourself into tactically relevant parts of the table. Now, as a little bit of a note on etiquette, a lot of players simply abbreviate this process by placing a unit 3 inches plus their movement away from a transport. So let's say, for example, that we were attempting to disembark our tactical marines and then move them this way. So a 3-inch disembarkation plus a 6-inch movement means that they would have a total movement threat essentially of 9 inches from where they started. However, it's important to note that that's not entirely how things work. You do actually set up the unit first and then move them, meaning that in some situations, like for example here, where we have this wall in between where the unit wants to disembark and where the transport is, their setup is going to be restricted. So using that placement plus movement abbreviation is actually getting you a little bit of extra movement when you wouldn't necessarily have it. So what you should do is definitely, in any time you're disembarking units, measure out where those units can be disembarked to. So as we can see here, if we wanted to go the full 3 inches from the Land Raider, we would actually be inside this wall, and that's not a legal placement. You would end up kind of losing an inch or two of the Tactical Marines placements just because of the surrounding terrain and enemy models. As normal, you can't disembark into engagement range with enemies, so enemy model positioning can prevent you from disembarking into a place, and then you would move, and in this case we can see that we're going to be going a lot shorter of a distance than we would have thought. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I see a lot of players do that, especially when disembarking around terrain and stuff, and technically it is gaining a little bit of an extra advantage. Now, another important note is large models that are disembarking. According to the core rules, they actually wouldn't be able to fit many models wholly within 3 inches of the transport that they're disembarking from. We have a Storm Raven here, for example, that can transport a single Dreadnought, but the Dreadnought's base is too large to set up wholly within that 3-inch bubble. However, the rules commentary does have an exception for this. If your model is physically too large to fit within that 3-inch bubble, then you are able to deploy it 1 inch away from the transport. So in this case, it would be like that, and that is a legal placement. Now, you still have to satisfy all the other restrictions, so this doesn't apply if your disembarkation is being blocked by things, and that would not normally allow you to disembark. This is only for models that are physically too big to normally fit within that 3-inch gap. Now, in any situation, whether you're a big model or a little model, if all of the possible areas of disembarkation are blocked from you by enemy models or by terrain, you are not allowed to voluntarily disembark. So in this situation, the Dreadnought can't disembark over here on the side of the Storm Raven because there's a wall there. Everywhere else that they could normally disembark is being blocked by termagants, which means that the Dreadnought must remain embarked within the Storm Raven. It's not legally allowed to disembark. Now, this is a little bit different for destroyed transports, which we're going to talk about momentarily here. Destroyed transports actually have a couple exceptions for situations like these, but it is one important piece of counterplay to transports. You can potentially lock your opponent's units inside them simply by surrounding them and cutting off their areas of setup. Now, importantly as well, if you have a multi-model unit that's attempting that disembarkation. So let's say, for example, that we were attempting to disembark with these Tactical Marines, but didn't have enough space for the entire unit to get out. That would actually also be an illegal disembarkation. You're not allowed to voluntarily lose models that you can't set up from your unit in order to make space for them. The entire unit must be able to be placed on the table for any disembarkation to be legal outside of destroyed transport disembarkation. Now, I should note as well that the rules are a little unclear about when exactly disembarkation happens, when in the movement phase. According to the World Championship FAQ, however, which is sort of the rules as intended from the design team, I guess, this does occur during the normal movement section of the phase. So outside of special abilities, transports that arrive from reserve, so for example, if the Storm Raven gunship was in aircraft mode, it could not then disembark units from it until the next turn. There are some units with abilities that get around this. Drop pods and Tyrannocytes, for example, disembark their occupants immediately after reserving. Those are special cases, but normally transports cannot disembark units after arriving from reserve. So that's disembarking. Now let's talk about embarking while on the table, which is, to be fair, a much easier process. After a unit finishes a movement phase style of move, that means a normal move, advance, or fallback movement, as long as that movement ends with every single model in the unit within 3 inches of the transport, notably not wholly within 3 inches, so it's a much easier requirement to get to than disembarking, then the unit can embark. So after the movement is completed, the unit embarks. They are then removed from the battlefield and placed into their shadow zone of being inside the transport. There's some interesting use cases for this because It works after every normal move, advance or fall back, not necessarily those that are completed in the movement phase. So there are units, for example, that can shoot after moving. A good example in this situation are Primaris Eliminators that can use their Instigator Bolt Carbine to move after shooting. So they can fire their weapons, make a normal move, and then use that movement to embark a transport. The only restriction on this is that units cannot disembark a transport in the same phase that they then embark a transport. But other than that, as long as the unit completes that move within 3 inches of the transport with every model of the unit, then they're good to go. Now, it should be noted that there are no restrictions against embarking or disembarking while a transport is engaged, and a unit can even be engaged themselves and then fall back towards a transport and then embark into the transport. However, it should be noted that a transport that falls back itself cannot then disembark passengers. Transports can only disembark passengers after a normal move, so it can't advance or fall back and then disembark. However, if it stays in melee, it could disembark normally and then elect to fall back later in the phase if it wants to. It should go without saying, though, that because a unit needs to complete a normal move, advance, or fall back, they can't embark while engaged. Those styles of movements can't end in the engagement range of enemies. So you'd have to fall back first and fall back to a position where you're within 3 inches of the transport to then embark into the transport in order for that to be legal. Now let's talk about blowing transports up, because as I mentioned before, there are some different rules for resolving disembarks from destroyed transports. Now, as soon as a transport is destroyed, if that transport has the deadly demise ability, that's the rule that causes things to explode when they die, you roll and resolve the deadly demise first before doing any transport disembarkations. Once that's resolved, if the transport has that ability, then you immediately disembark the units inside. This is a normal disembark, so everybody stands wholly within 3 inches of the transport. Once that's concluded, you roll a d6 for every single model in the unit. On a 1, the unit suffers 1 mortal wound, so this is a damage that bypasses saves, however is otherwise allocated like a normal attack. So in this case, we would roll a d6 for each tactical marine in the squad, so we'd roll 5d6. On the result of a 1, 1 mortal wound is suffered, so 2 mortal wounds would apply to the unit. That would kill 1 tactical marine because they have 2 wounds apiece. Pretty simple. Now, it's important to note that this occurs after you set up the unit. So you don't know how many wounds you take from the disembarkation damage before you set them up. So you can't operate with that knowledge in mind. This is important if you're trying to set your models up in a position where they could be out of line of sight or out of danger, for example. Setting up 5 models that are out of line of sight is a lot tougher than setting up 4 models. So you don't know if this damage has been applied first. So it's important to roll those in the correct sequence to not get additional information that you shouldn't have. Now, as we said before, surrounding transports and blocking their avenues of egress from the disembarking units is a good way to stymie the power of the transport. You then reduce your opponent's threat range, you make it harder for them to set up, and in some cases you can do additional damage to them. In this case, obviously, the termagants have entirely surrounded the Land Raider such that there's no position where the tactical marines could disembark outside of the termagant engagement range. They still must disembark outside engagement range, and the disembarkation is required, meaning that unlike a voluntary disembark, if there's not enough space for 1 or more models, they'll still do so. However, if a model would not have enough space to set up, they can perform instead what is called an emergency disembark. This allows you to disembark wholly within 6 inches rather than 3 inches. So for example, we could set the entire unit up over here, well outside of engagement range of the termagants. But the downside is that that roll to suffer mortal wounds is much higher. That then occurs on a 1, 2, or 3 rather than just a 1. So in this case, the unit would be suffering 3 mortal wounds, losing 1.5 Space Marines instead of the single Space Marine that we suffered in the other example. Now, it's important to note that emergency disembarkation cannot be used voluntarily. It is triggered when a unit attempts to disembark a destroyed transport but doesn't have enough space for all their models. You aren't allowed to lose a transport that is not surrounded by enemy units, and then voluntarily elect to use an emergency disembark. In that case, the emergency disembarkation rule wouldn't trigger, so your units would disembark 3 inches away as normal. Now let's say, for the sake of example, that the Tyranid player has an endless number of termagants and is able to effectively screen out the emergency disembark. In that case, if there's no position wholly within 6 inches of this land raider for those disembarking models, then they are destroyed. Any models not able to set up incoherency with the unit are removed from play as a casualty. That can allow you in some instances. So for example, if we had a little bit of a space here for 1 or 2 models, we would set them up one at a time and attempt to get them into coherency. And we might get 2 inside that 6-inch band. And then from there, the rest of the unit would be out of range and they would be removed as casualties. So it is possible to lose some additional models to casualties. It is very difficult, however, because as you can see, you need to be able to block off 6 inches away from the whole transport, which is super duper difficult. But what you can do is, because as many models as possible are required to set up on the battlefield, you can force the disembarking unit into a particular situation. And one particular piece of counterplay that you can use is trying to give your opponent avenues of disembarkation. So for example, in this situation, if there's a space for this combat squad that is wholly within 3 inches of the land raider, the Tyranid player could try to force them to disembark in that position. So for example, we could force the Tactical Marines to disembark here, and if we have a very strong melee threat there that's ready to follow up against that unit in the future phase, then you can guide where they disembark to and use that to kill the models inside. Or simply, if you're doing this in the shooting phase, shoot them to death with other ranged attacks that you have. Similarly, you could give them a place to disembark that's far away from your units. If we put the termagants here instead and then opened up an avenue for disembark in the back of the Land Raider, that means that the Tactical Marines would be forced to disembark into a position that's far away from the other Tyranid models, and they may not necessarily be threatening as much of the Tyranid army as they would have normally. So there are ways, especially if you have aggressive and fast melee units, to guide where units disembark to. And obviously, if you're forcing that emergency disembark, there is additional damage being suffered by the units embarked within the transport. It is possible to kill units embarked in transports by blocking off every single avenue that they have to disembark and then forcing them to die because they can't set up incoherency, but it's very difficult since that emergency disembark is going to allow them so much room to disembark into. Now, and another important thing to note is that spillover damage from a transport is not applied to the unit. The unit is entirely immune to damage until it's on the table, outside of the disembarkation damage. So even if the Land Raider had 1 wound left and we shot it for 1 billion damage, the unit inside would then just disembark and be fine outside of the mortal wounds that you roll for. That one's a little bit wonky. You can do 100 damage to a transport, but the unit inside is totally protected and safe, but that is how it works. So with that, those are the mechanics of transports on the table. Let's talk about some other ones. Now, we said that units embarked inside a transport can't really contribute to the fight at all. And that's not entirely true, because many transports have the ability Firing Deck. That allows units inside transports to fire out of the transport. This is a unique ability that allows units inside the transport to still contribute to the fight by firing their ranged weapons at units outside the transport. Now, this rule is kind of counterintuitive, which is absolutely crazy for Warhammer 40k, right? So let's break it down in specific. When a firing deck unit shoots in the shooting phase, so it doesn't work in out-of-phase effects like Overwatch, for example, that's an important thing to note, you can choose a number of models embarked inside the transport up to the firing deck value. So for example, if you had a firing deck 2 transport, you would choose 2 embarked models. For each of the models that you choose, they contribute 1 weapon to the transport's ranged attack. It's a little convoluted, but it means that if you have a character or a special weapon model with multiple weapons on their profile, they cannot choose more than 1 of them to use. For each of those models that you choose, the transport then pushes that model up against the lockers, steals their lunch money, and takes their equipped weapon for itself. The weapon is considered to be wielded by the transport for the remainder of that shooting activation. So while conceptually, the unit inside the transport is popping out the top, using the firing decks or firing ports to shoot their weapons outside, what's actually happening is that the transport crew steals their weapons, duct takes them to the side of the transport, uses them to shoot 1 time, and then gives them back to the unit.
It was low-key poggers.
Importantly, this means that things like leadership abilities and special roles on the datasheet of the embarked unit are not applied when using firing deck. It doesn't matter how many lieutenants you attach into a squad inside a Rhino, he's not giving them lethal hit. However, special rules and effects applied to the transport will apply to those attacks. So if you have a +1 to hit effect, you're inside an aura that's buffing you, you have a stratagem that's used on the transport, all of those will affect the firing deck attacks because the transport is the model making the attacks. Like I said, it's a little counterintuitive, but it does work this way to smooth things out mechanically and to add some interesting synergistic play. You can use a Tech Marine, for example, to give +1 to hit to a transport, then use that transport to firing deck the units inside and benefit from the Tech Marine's +1 to hit. That's kind of cool. Now, interestingly, the firing deck doesn't select the Embarked unit to shoot, meaning that it is possible for them to use their weapons with firing deck in addition to being selected to shoot in the shooting phase itself. There are only a couple ways to do this, and they're extremely corner case, but it is technically possible rules as written and has never been ruled on by the rules team. For example, a transport vehicle that is destroyed after shooting in its own shooting phase as a result of hazardous damage, potentially from weapons that it is using with firing deck, since those failed hazardous tests would apply to the transport since it's the model shooting the guns, or reactive fire from a shoot back stratagem, shooting back at the transport after it has shot itself, then destroying the transport and causing the embarked unit to disembark. The disembarked unit has not yet been selected to shoot, so they are then eligible to fire, and then you can blaze away with that unit as well. On top of that, there are some units that move after shooting, and then, as we talked about in the previous section, can embark after making a normal move. So something like a eliminator squad that is able to move after shooting, use that move to embark inside a transport, and then use the transport's firing deck to shoot again. That is technically possible. This is a bit of a weird one. Definitely check with your local community because it's not entirely sure it's the intended interaction, but certainly in some corner cases allows units to fire multiple times in the shooting phase. Now with that, we've talked about transports mechanics on the tabletop. So let's talk about transports in reserve. In Leviathan games of Warhammer 40k, there are some restrictions on how many units and the value of those units that are in reserve. For example, strategic reserves can only constitute 25% of your total army value, and total reserves can only equal half of the total number of units in your army, as well as half of your points. That includes abilities like Deep Strike and units that are in strategic reserve. Since reserve considerations are determined after embarking inside transports, you know all of your leadership attachments and your embarked units when you go to your reserves step inside the battle formation step. And units inside a transport that is then put into reserve are also considered in reserve themselves and also count against those restrictions. So for example, a transport carrying a unit that is placed into reserve would contribute the total value of the embarked unit and the transport to the value restriction on the amount of stuff that you have in reserve, and contribute 2 units to the total number of units that you have in reserve. Now, it is important to note that some models, like drop pods, have rules that override the restrictions on the number of units you can put into reserve. Now, this one's always been a little bit funky, and they've never changed this wording for 3 editions to my knowledge, but rules as written, this means that they are ignored for purposes of counting how many units are inside reserve. So when you're trying to determine whether half of your army is in reserve or not, discount the drop pods entirely. However, the value of those units is not ignored, so they still count towards the 50% of your total army value that can be in reserve. Again, that's probably not an intended interaction. That's one to check with your local community for before you do any chicanery with drop pods, because it is a little unclear. With all that said, transport's real strength is beginning the game on the battlefield. They add survivability, threat range, tactical flexibility, and in some cases, even additional offensive output to their embarked units, especially for an exceptionally low cost in the case of many dedicated transports. So I hope this video was eye-opening to you. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Let me know down in the comment section which transport in Warhammer 40k is your favorite. Big thanks to VoxLink for sponsoring this video. You can check them out in the link in the video description and in the pinned comment. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All your people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.